Uh, Hi there. Look, I've decided to do a quick update on a podcast I did a couple of weeks ago called "Are We Headed for a Food Shock?" And just to include some more Ukrainian analysis, particularly at the end, just to give a bit more color. And I think also helps to explain the markets we've seen the last few years much more clearly. Um, this one will be a free one. The original was a paid, which I thought was quite a good presentation. So if you're a free subscriber, let me encourage you to become a paid one. You'll get access to data a bit earlier, which is for traders with significant portfolios. I think very value add in my view. Uh, you know, I constantly mix between paid and sort of freed, really to encourage those that can generate substantial amounts of money from ideas a bit earlier than other people to pay up, and hopefully to subsidize a much larger free community for retail traders and other such people like that. Okay, with that base on that back, with that said, let me just go on to, are we headed for a food shock? So the reason I'm talking about food shock is that I think it's not well known, but China is by far the largest holder of grain stocks in the world. And China has been known to hold grain for up to 5 years after it's harvested. Now, what I think this shows most dramatically is the emphasis that having secure food supply that China places, the Chinese Communist Party places on that policy. I think it's largely driven by the absolutely horrendous famines they suffered in the 50s and 70s, but it sort of speaks to their view on how important food supply is. Um, so on that basis, China suffered a shock a couple of years ago when African swine flu, which has been a problem that's endemic in Europe and Africa for many decades, finally made it to Asia and decimated the Chinese pig herd. And this briefly led China to become the world's biggest pork importer by quite some way. So a sign that they were becoming more and more reliant on overseas production for food. Now, as they've rebuilt their herd in last year or so, they've become more and more reliant on imports of coarse grain. And coarse grain is mainly corn, but also sorghum and barley, and is used to feed, particularly for pigs. And there's a bit of a sort of gap here. You feed your pig for 9 months to 18 months before it can then be harvested. And so what we're now seeing is this big herd is rising. China's become a huge importer of grain. Now, you would think that as they rebuild their herd, eventually Chinese imports of grain would drop off. However, when you look at the Chinese productions of grain more carefully, you start to see some problems emerging. So if we look back at the three main crops China grows, rice, wheat, and corn, what we can see is with rice and wheat, production has been flatlining for the last couple of decades. It's only really corn that has grown. And even there, in the last few years, it started to flatline. So it's suggestive that the easy gains that came from leaving communist methods behind have been largely taken. So low-hanging fruit has been taken in the grain production industry. That view is strengthened by the fact that China now is the largest subsidizer of grain production, or largest payer of agricultural subsidies in the world, much larger than the EU or the US or Japan, historically, who we would associate with agricultural subsidies. So it's suggestive that China needs to pay farmers to help grow, and also, again, suggestive of how much importance they place on food supply. The other telltale sign that not all is good in Chinese grain production is the increasing use of fertilizer. Modern farming techniques have tried to de-emphasize the use of fertilizer. If you look at the US, fertilizer production is lower today than it was in the late 70s. Even in India, fertilizer production has sort of flatlined for the last decade or so. But China has continued to use more. Again, suggestive that a lot of the land that they've brought online to try and grow corn production in particular has been very marginal. So the issue that China faces is that if we look at sort of wheat, which is typically imported for human consumption, China imports about 10 million tons of wheat a year at the moment. It's a large number. It's not the largest in the world, but it's quite large. they can easily source that from Russian exports, which are about 35 million tons. So from a sort of CCP central planning point of view, um, Russia is a safe supplier, shares a border, they have similar political sort of ideologies, so that is secure food supply. Coarse grain is very different. Russia exports about 10 million, and China now, in the last year, has been importing up to 50 million tons of coarse grain. Now, the other bigger exporter of grain, of course, is Ukraine in that area. And so Russia that controls Ukraine will suddenly turn coarse grain also into a safe food from the Chinese perspective. Without Ukrainian exports, China would rely on the Americas, US, Argentina, and Brazil. US is by far the largest producer. And this would, of course, create some issues. Politically, Brazil and Argentina are probably more closely aligned to China. It's debatable, particularly in Argentinian perspective, but probably close to the US. And even more problematic is that all that grain would have to be sourced by ships. And of course, ships can be subject to various maritime laws on all the routes that they sail to, making North American grain or American grain far less strategically safe than, let's say, Russian and Ukrainian grain that can be shipped by rail. And I think this is probably one of the core drivers behind maybe what seems to be a relatively relaxed view by the Chinese on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If we start thinking about commodities strategically in this way, we start to see signs that the markets have been doing this for a while. So I'm from Australia. The Australian dollar has normally followed the commodity cycle pretty closely. And because it's done that, it very rarely runs a trade surplus. So, when commodity prices rise, the Aussie dollar strengthens, the Aussie consumer goes out and buys more stuff, more cars, more utes, whatever they need, and so the trade surplus stays relatively stable within a certain amount. When the commodity prices fall, Aussie dollar falls, consumption falls, so it tends never to book a very large trade surplus. However, in the last few years, as the commodity prices have risen, the Aussie dollar has stayed low, and the trade surplus has, boomed to levels never seen before. So from a sort of free market macro thinking, which is what I was using, I would have said the Aussie dollar was a buy and been a buy for the last couple of years. It has not moved in that way. If I start thinking about a strategic point of view, Australia being a strong political ally of the US, but reliant on China for most of its exports, including some grain exports, but also other things like iron ore and coal, you start going, well, actually, do I really want to own the Aussie dollar here? What are the risks I'm running? And if we look at what the market is doing, the market is acting on the strategic rather than the free market far more than I would have thought. And these, I think, has big implications for investors going forward. So the two conclusions is, and the big one, of course, I think is China is likely to become a food importer. Now, I originally foresaw this as being extremely problematic for the US and the West, where we've become heavily reliant on credit markets and central bank largesse to drive growth in the asset markets. I now see it as being incredibly destabilizing for geopolitical reasons. That China is going to take a much more expansive view on foreign relations to secure its food supplies, and this looks like it includes so green lighting Russian expansionism if necessary. The obvious conclusion as well is that do we start thinking about semiconductors, oil, and other areas, and how will that affect relationships? And I certainly think that is an important issue that people need to consider. I also sort of wonder about countries like Indonesia and Malaysia, which are key suppliers of crude palm oil, which China is a big importer of as well. And so suddenly, we go from a very simple investing market, or it probably hasn't been that simple for a while, but we could predict which assets would move better with stronger commodity prices. I think these days you need to think about the geopolitical implications of policy and commodities. It's not as simple as it used to be. All right, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for your time. Again, if you're a professional trader or manage a large amount of money, and I've helped you make some money the last couple of months or so, please feel free to be a paid subscriber and help support the large number of free subscribers we have on this. All right. Thank you for your time.